For being here. My name is David Skelly. I'm Professor of Ecology and Associate Dean for Research in the school. And on behalf of Dean Peter Crane and everyone else, I'd like to welcome you to our event on hydraulic fracturing. This is much more than a 1 hour plus event. This is something that a whole bunch of people had a lot of input into going back to last spring. And I'm gratified to say that the response to the community by giving some early attention to this, the faculty and especially the students have latched on to the idea that an event like this with great participants can also kind of feed into the other things that are going on in the life of the school. And I'm sure that'll come up as the evening goes on here. I have a few people to thank, and then I'm going to step out of the way. I'm going to introduce our moderator in just a moment. Most importantly, I want to thank Bethany Zemba for all of the work that she's done in organizing this event. And helping her along have been an enormous number of staff and especially students. There are dozens and dozens of students who've put many tens and hundreds of hours into getting ready for this moment right now. Many staff as well. I'd like to single out Stuart DeCue and the Center for Business and Environment at Yale, and just to give you a flavor of some of what's going on offline related to this event. Stuart and his team are working with Yale School of Management and folks at Cornell to develop a case study that's going to be inspired by what's going on here today and go well beyond it. I'd also like to thank our FES communications and IT teams for making everything go perfectly so far. And the Yale Broadcast Studio for helping us to get the message out on this stuff. And now I'll turn to great pleasure in introducing Brad Gentry. So Brad arrived at Yale, I think we worked out about 6 months before I did in 1995, but I think of him because he got here before me as part of the old guard, which probably isn't fair. Brad has been involved in all aspects of the school that you can possibly imagine, and is a real kind of catalytic point for exactly what we're doing here today. So he's going to be making sure everyone else gets their say today, but let me just point out that this is a very talented individual that we've been able to coax into playing this role today. He's director of Yale's Center for Business and the Environment. He's also a professor in the practice at our school here. He's trained as a biologist and as an attorney. I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions about what went wrong there. And his work focuses in particular in ways to increase investment in improved environmental performance. Brad's somebody who kind of knows the concepts, he knows the theory, but he's also a really pragmatic person. So he deals in different aspects of his work life with governments, business, NGO. He's also a very popular teacher here at the school, focusing on multidisciplinary courses on managing fresh water, emerging markets for ecosystem services, as well as the legal, financial, and managerial strategies for conserving land. And so I'm going to ask you to thank all the folks who made today happen, and also to thank Brad Gentry for his contribution.
Thanks, Dave, for that extremely kind introduction. And the topic for our panel today is hydraulic fracturing a bridge to a clean energy future. Is exactly the type of issue that we at the school want to bring out in events like these. Vitally important, controversial, deserving of critical debate across a range of perspectives, including those we've gathered for our panel today. Let me just talk briefly about the format. We're going to start by asking each panelist to give a short answer to this overarching question of bridge to a clean energy future. I'll then follow up with a first round of questions to each of the panelists while offering the other panelists a chance to comment. Then the students who've been working so hard to collect questions offline and from the cards that were given to each of you will pass them to me for asking, and by then it'll be 5:30, I am sure, and the wine will be flowing out in the space behind us. Before I introduce our panelists, and just to make sure we're all starting from the same page, I did ask Jim Sayers for a basic definition of hydraulic fracturing, just to make sure we all are working from the same spot. A process used to extract gas or oil that involves creation of fractures in a rock layer through rapid injection of pressurized fluid. And that's the question we're going to explore with our panelists today. And what a wonderful group we have. Jim at the far end is a professor of hydrology here at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. He publishes extensively on the factors affecting the circulation of fresh water and the transport of contaminants and other chemicals in streams, wetlands, and aquifers. Jim also grew up in Port Allegheny, a 2-traffic light town sitting on top of the Marcellus shale field. So not surprisingly, a lot of Jim's work seeks to improve our understanding of the water quality and water supply impacts of our Marcellus shale gas development, and to help devise practices that minimize these impacts in order to protect access to safe drinking water and the health of freshwater ecosystems. Sheila Olmsted is an environmental economist and a fellow at Resources for the Future in Washington, D.C. Before joining RFF in 2010, Sheila was an associate professor here at the school, and we're thrilled to have her back today. Sheila's current research examines, among other things, the environmental externalities associated with shale gas development in the United States, as well as regulatory avoidance under the U.S. Safe Drinking Water Act and a number of other issues. Her research has been published in many leading journals, and along with Nat Cohen, she's the author of the 2007 book, Markets and the Environment. She's a member of the board of directors of the Association of Environmental and Resource Economists, as well as the advisory board of the International Water Resource Economics Consortium. John Hofmeister, next to Jim, is the former president of the Shell Oil Company and founder of the not-for-profit nationwide membership association, Citizens for Affordable Energy. As president of Shell, he launched an extensive outreach program involving an 18-month 50-city tour across the country in which John and 250 other Shell leaders met with more than 15,000 business, community, civic leaders, policymakers, and academics to discuss what should be done to ensure affordable, available energy for the future in the U.S. As head of Citizens for Affordable Energy, John continues to promote sound U.S. energy security solutions for our nation, including a range of affordable energy supplies, efficiency improvements, essential infrastructure, sustainable environmental policies, and public education on energy issues. John is also the author of a wonderfully titled book, Why We Hate the Oil Companies, Straight Talk from an Energy Insider, and serves on several boards, including that of the United States Energy Security Council. Bill McKibben is the Schumann Distinguished Scholar at Middlebury College and the author of a dozen books about the environment, beginning in 1989 with The End of Nature, regarded as the first book for a general audience on climate change. He's also a founder of the grassroots climate organization, 350.org, which has coordinated over 15,000 rallies in 189 countries around the world since 2009. A tireless advocate on behalf of the planet, Time magazine called Bill the planet's best green journalist, and in 2010, the Boston Globe said that Bill was probably the country's most important environmentalist. So given this range of experience and expertise, you can see why we're so excited about today's panel. So let's get started. Each panelist now has 3 to 5 minutes to offer their answer to the question of whether hydraulic fracturing is a bridge to a clean energy future. We'll start with Jim, then move to Sheila, John, and Bill. Jim?
Thank you, Brad. Hydraulic fracturing has the potential to unlock tremendous volumes of natural gas from shale-bearing basins spread throughout the world. This rush to shale in the United States has made natural gas very affordable, but there are trade-offs. Shale gas, like all fossil fuels, is dirty. Its combustion generates carbon dioxide, a gaseous waste that we as a nation have failed to manage and that is overheating our planet. The notion that the shale gas boom will lead to U.S. energy independence is a myth, and natural gas made cheap by hydraulic fracturing will lower deployment of renewables in the absence of protective policies. At the local level, sloppy practices of some shale gas producers have led to the pollution of household drinking water wells by methane. The effects of this contamination and other burdens are borne unequally by the populace, and so are the royalties from produced shale gas. These inequalities tear at the social fabric of small towns that host shale gas extraction. These are facts, and as facts, they're indisputable. But it is equally true that the greenhouse gas footprint of modern gas-fired electric power plants is threefold smaller than the coal-fired power plants that they are now displacing. Moreover, combustion of natural gas, unlike combustion of coal, emits no life-threatening mercury and substantially less smog-forming particulates and sulfur dioxide. It is also true that U.S. manufacturing cannot thrive without affordable natural gas, and that low-priced natural gas enables millions of low-income families to heat their homes in tap water. And while tragic for those individuals affected, incidences of drinking water contamination caused by shale gas extraction are in fact rare, and decreasing in frequency as more stringent gas well construction and waste disposal standards are set in place. The good and bad of shale gas development walk hand in hand. There's more than one side of this complex story, and hence plenty of room for debate. However, the debate over whether the bad outweighs the good or vice versa is a distraction that prevents us from attending to one important reality. That is, natural gas will surely be a part of the U.S. and worldwide energy portfolio for decades to come. And shale gas extraction will endure in areas where it occurs now, and it will expand to other regions, perhaps not to your neighborhood or community, but to other parts of the United States and the world. Thus, the essential issue is not whether shale gas is good or whether it's bad. It's inherently neither. Rather, the issue that should command our attention involves managing shale gas development to minimize the negative impacts on the environment and shaping an energy policy that promotes natural gas displacement of dirtier fossil fuels while allowing for the growth of carbon-free renewables. We were asked to address in our opening comments the following question: is shale gas a bridge to a clean energy future, or simply a bridge to a future resembling a bleaker, more spoiled version of today? This future has not been fully written. Shale gas development will proceed. However, our future will be determined less by this inevitability than by the management and policy choices we make going forward.
Thank you, Jim. Sheila? In the second round of questions, I'll give people an opportunity to comment on each other's comments. But we thought we'd get everybody out there to start with.
Well, my comment on Jim's comments is great overview, which frees me up to maybe talk a little bit more about specific details on the question about whether, in fact, this vast new source of domestic fossil fuel resources is a bridge to a clean energy future. And the first thing I would say is that, as Brad mentioned in his definition of hydraulic fracturing, that term or that technology is used not just to extract shale gas, but also for many other types of fossil fuel resources, including shale oil. And so there's a sort of broader question about the technology. Most of my comments, or essentially all my comments today, will have to do with shale gas. But some of them will be relevant to those other resources like shale oil that are being extracted using the same technology, and many others will not. For example, the comments about carbon, to which Jim alluded to in his talk. So I guess I would say when we ask whether shale gas is a bridge to a clean energy future, we could mean many different things. The first thing, and I think one thing that a lot of people mean when they say that, is it a bridge to a low carbon future? And there I think really the jury is still out, and the jury is still out for 3 reasons. The first is that it's certainly true, as Jim pointed out, that natural gas and combustion produces less carbon emissions than coal, for example. And so in that sense, it's really quite preferable from the perspective of climate. But also, natural gas is methane. Methane itself is a potent global greenhouse gas, and in fact has a higher global warming potential than carbon, at least in the short run. And so there have been some really important questions raised about, in a life cycle sense, whether when you're supplying natural gas, right, from start to finish, and you sort of compare that to coal after we've gone through the process of combustion as well, whether on balance for climate, natural gas is in fact an improvement over coal. And I think the problem with that debate currently is that there are a lot of numbers out there. There's actually not that much space percentage-wise between the numbers in terms of how much fugitive methane escapes in the natural gas supply chain. But the problem is that that sort of uncertainty bound falls right around the number that would have to be, in fact, true for gas, at least in the United States context, to be better than coal in terms of electricity generation as a climate change driver. So that's a really super important empirical question. Anyone out there who's interested in working on methane should be working on methane, because I really think if that piece is sort of not in place, and we don't know the answer to that question, it's awfully hard to proceed with shale gas development with the confidence that this is going to be good for climate. The second reason I think that it's an open question, even when we're just talking about whether in fact it's a bridge to a low carbon future, is that gas, just in the way that it backs out coal in electricity production in a country like the US, and especially at current very, very low prices, it also backs out some renewables and some nuclear and some things that actually have lower carbon emissions even than gas. And so that's true even, in models indicate, at least at RFF and other places, that's true even if we had a national climate policy in place that had some kind of price on carbon. Okay, so there's always going to be this sort of substitution that happens not just on the bad stuff, not just on coal, but also on other things that you might think are more desirable if you're primarily concerned about carbon emissions. And then finally, low gas prices, which are great. Anybody who went through New Haven's winter last winter would have had very low heating bills relative to the winters prior. And that's in part because it was quite warm here, but it's also in part because of shale gas. So as Jim mentioned, this has already certainly affected people's utility bills in the residential sense, commercial, industrial, all kinds of manufacturing have really benefited from these low prices. But when you have low prices, right, you have lower electricity prices, increase demand, and so you have some increase in emissions associated with that economic impact as well. And so when you package those three things together, the methane question, the increased consumption from low prices, and you could ask, well, how long will those prices stay low? It's sort of hard to say, but nobody's really seriously talking about prices above $5 for gas before, say, 2020 or 2025, so low for the foreseeable future, and also the backing out of other less or lower carbon energy sources. This question of whether it's really a bridge to a low carbon future is, I think, still an open empirical question. Second, if you're talking about being a bridge to a kind of cleaner local air pollution future, then I think unquestionably it's a clear winner. Not necessarily with respect to wind or solar, right, but certainly with respect to coal, which provides a significant chunk still, and certainly in the United States and certainly in developing countries, of the fuel for electricity generation. So if you're concerned mostly about local air pollution, then I think the jury's not out. I think it is an important bridge to a cleaner future. And then finally, the other key factor is, of course, the other local environmental impacts, and Jim mentioned these in his discussion as well. So if you're not thinking just about local air pollution, but you're thinking about surface water contamination, or the possibility of groundwater contamination, or increased congestion and truck traffic and accidents and all of those things that the communities that are currently experiencing the shale gas boom might be concerned about. There again, while many of these are low probability events and are not happening very frequently, we don't have enough experience yet, in my view, with shale gas to say whether, in fact, on a large scale, right, what the magnitude of these kinds of externalities is, how we might monetize them, how those compare to the benefits both at the local and national scale. So again, there's sort of a whole huge set of really interesting questions for science to resolve before we could really know whether, in that sense, natural gas, these new natural gas supplies are a bridge to a clean energy future.
Thank you very much. John?
Thank you. Citizens for Affordable Energy promotes the idea of available, affordable, and sustainable energy. We're not funded by any energy companies. We're only funded by consumers. So I spent a lot of time in the public domain talking about this topic as well as others, but I'll just concentrate on the question. Is it a bridge? I think it's a highway. Think of the I-10 from Jacksonville, Florida to Santa Monica, California. Natural gas is a highway to the future, and yes, a cleaner, more sustainable future for a number of the following reasons. First of all, let me just say, if you've ever been to a frack site, it's dirty, filthy dirty, noisy, smoky, dusty. When you get 15 or more compression trucks generating 15,000 horsepower each to force sand, water, and chemicals downhole in order to bring the proppants into place to open up the molecules for movement under, a mile below the surface of the earth, 2 miles from the drill site, you know that you are putting a lot of energy into that earth, into that well. And witnessing it is about as pleasurable as witnessing the source of your hamburgers, chicken wings, or bacon. It's not pleasant, but we like the effect. Because the effect is low-cost energy to keep us warm, will keep us cool, keep the lights on, and really to provide economic value creation and economic security across many sectors of the economy. Let me suggest, and for full disclosure, I'm on the board of directors of Hunting PLC. If your computer's open and you want to Google Hunting PLC, you'll see that we are an equipment supplier to the drilling industry, and we make the tubulars that go down the well. We acquired, within the past 15 months, the company that creates the frac charges itself, the explosives. So I'm very closely associated with what goes on, and I can tell you that from my prior experience as president of Shell up to and including my current board experience, I would submit that there is more engineering, more risk abatement, more time, human capital, human ingenuity that goes into a frac job or a drilling, a well site, than goes into heart surgery. It is an incredible process with the best that man can know about what to do to penetrate that earth and to do it in a way that is sustainable and repeatable and meets the criteria of most every energy company I know, which is do no harm. Do no harm to people, do no harm to the environment, and be able to maintain your license to operate in the public domain. There are exceptions, and I'm more than happy to discuss the exceptions, not the least of which was the environmental and human disaster in the Gulf of Mexico on the Deepwater Horizon debacle. Given the technology and given the opportunity to continue this process and the learning that occurs as the process continues, there is actually an effort underway. A friend of mine, Armand Cohen of the Clean Air Task Force from Boston, currently working with the largest energy companies to create a voluntary set of gold standards which the energy companies will sign up for, which does the kinds of things that need to be done if this is to be a long-standing industrial effort in this country, the things that need to be done to tighten the wells, tighten the casings, tighten the cement jobs, take an approach to water management with respect to containment and treatment, as is the case of a new nanotechnology product developed at Rice University in Houston, in which you can take the fracked water out of the well with all of the pollutants that come with it, everything from the benzene to the nasty stuff, and it is nasty stuff, I won't deny that. And after treating the product, the water, in this water containment system, all that it remains as the water is emitted is clear brine. Also with commissioning or decommissioning the well, standards that prevent leakage, standards that when a well is killed, it's killed for good. So there are, I think, many improvements that can be made against the engineering standards of what we know and what we are learning that we can do, and we should continue that evolution. I think we need this highway. I think the economy needs it. I think the people of America do not like the fear, anxiety, and insecurity of either shortages or unavailable energy, and they certainly don't like high-cost energy.
Thank you very much.
Bill?
Wow, what a pleasure to be here in New Haven and in this beautiful hall, really the kind of house that Gus Speth built yesterday. Gus, one of my old friends, and friendship deepened this last year when we spent a couple of nights in adjoining cells in the Washington, D.C. jail. So I have all good thoughts to think about Yale. Let me say that 4 or 5 years ago, when word first leaked out of some of these new gas finds along the Marcellus, like a lot of environmentalists, was somewhat intrigued to think of a new supply of natural gas and what it might mean. I went to work to try and figure out what it might mean for myself, and as usual, since I'm a writer, my vehicle for doing that was to write a long and piece for the New York Review of Books, a very long piece. maybe too long. That's sort of the New York Review of Books, you know. But the research for doing it and the experience being out in the field with lots of people who've experienced this firsthand made it clear to me that I think this is a very poor development, a very sad development. I don't think that it looks anything like heart surgery, and I don't think that the people, I thought John's very candid admission at the beginning was very true. When you see these sites, they're horrible and ugly. And none of the people who signed up, who signed over their land, knew that going in, and that's why there are thousands of them across Pennsylvania and other places who now are doing their best to try to get out of those leases, and once they've seen what happened. But I'm going to lay aside the questions about local water and air pollution, about what happens to landscape and habitat, about what happens to the fabric of communities when you're running thousands of trucks down every road every day, and just focus on the thing I know best, which is the climate implications. I want to make 4 points. One, frac gas has been constantly oversold as an answer to carbon. Earlier this year, there were, when carbon emissions in this country dipped some, there were all sorts of people and all sorts of publications claiming that this is the result of this fracking boom. A paper published last week from the Steyer-Taylor Center at Stanford made clear that at best gas had contributed less than a fifth of that, and that the warm winter was responsible for most of the effect that we saw. And trust me, a series of warm winters is not what we want as a kind of policy going forward. Two, even those small decreases in carbon are illusory because, as Sheila mentioned, what we're doing is really far, at least as much, and probably more than undercutting coal. We're undercutting the conversion to actually clean energy. Barclay Bank analysis from 2 weeks ago predicted that we would see a 12% decline next year in wind that would otherwise have been built in this country because of the effect of the availability of cheap natural gas. So that's gas that would have come, or power that would have come with no carbon attached to it at all. Three, which is why the long-term analyses that have been done have shown clearly that even if you somehow converted the whole planet to gas, you would end up with hopeless climate change. The International Energy Agency ran what they called a golden age of gas scenario in May. And the report said that if you were able to peak coal and oil production by 2020 and move us all onto gas, which is a rapid pace, you would end up with a 660 parts per million CO2 world and a 3.5 degrees Celsius increase in global average temperature. 1 degree has already melted the planet, and by the way, the only thing I will take issue with from what John said was the idea that the fossil fuel industry's big goal is to do no harm to the environment is a goal that they have failed to meet. The melting Arctic being one proof of that, the 30% more acid ocean being another, the 5% more moisture atmosphere because warm air holds more water vapor than cold being third. That's what we're going to have much, much, much more of if we, instead of pursuing renewables, pursue this easy course instead. And four, of course, as Sheila pointed out, even aside from all the data about carbon and natural gas, none of this even takes into account the fact that we don't know yet whether or not we'll make it, the methane consequences will make it even worse than coal in the long run. It depends entirely on what leakage rates are. There are kind of, at this point, a pair of dueling studies out of Cornell, one saying it will be 2%, and one saying it will be 4% leakage. The only actual on-the-ground study came in January from Science, I think, of frac field in Colorado indicating that the leakage rate there was 4%, i.e. enough to make it a worse technology than coal. In short, frac gas makes the climate crisis, at best, in carbon terms, a teensy bit better, and we're long past the point where baby steps help us in any way. In fact, if they keep us tottering down the current path, they make things worse. Frac gas is not a bridge into the future, but a rickety pier out further into the lake of hydrocarbons. And there's nothing inevitable about its development unless we say that there's something inevitable about it. I live in a state, Vermont, that banned fracking earlier this year. The citizens of New York are rallying everything at their disposal to try and overcome the money that the fossil fuel industry has thrown at Albany and at Governor Cuomo. There was a huge rally in Albany a couple of weeks ago. People are doing everything they can to try and keep the moratorium in place there. I think maybe the analogy that John gave to factory farming was kind of the perfect analogy. This is a way to do something cheaply that in the long run is bad for the landscape, bad for our bodies and our environment. We need to start thinking responsibly, not about bridges, but about the transformative leap into the future that we can have and that we would have if we forever stopped looking for easy, cheap ways out of our trouble. Thank you.
Well, as we promised, we've got quite a range of experience and points of view here. What I'm going to do now for the second round is take some of the questions that the students have helped put together and pose them to each of the panelists, and then give panelists an opportunity to comment on the answers that have been given. Jim, I'm going to ask a slightly unfair question to a scientist, but it picks up on part of what Bill was talking about dueling studies and the fact that there's an awful lot that's unknown from a scientific point of view. And as a scientist, Jim, you know, lots of scientists say policymakers never listen to me. You know, if a policymaker came and said, hey, you know, based on what we know and what we don't know, what would you do if you were a policymaker? Would you put a moratorium on fracking? Would you continue and watch? What's your recommendation in that regard?
Rather than offer a recommendation, I'm going to tell you what I think will happen.
When are you running for office?
There are 22 states where shale gas development is occurring. In the Rockies, in the Northeast, and even in California. I think that it's unlikely that we're going to see any statewide moratoriums like is going on in the state of New York. I also think that in several months, New York will partially lift that moratorium. Bill mentioned that there are several bans and moratoriums that are going on at the local level, and whether those bans can hold up against state authority remains to be seen. So I'm pretty convinced that shale gas development has a lot of support from our current administration, has support within the states. It will proceed. Now, in terms of research looking at its impact, not surprisingly, research lags. And research will continue to be reactive. It will respond to emerging problems. That's not how I would like to do it or how any of you would like to do it. But I think that's the immediate future. Moreover, I'll note that shale gas development is way out ahead of research on environmental impacts. And that landscape doesn't look any better going forward. There's far too little money going into looking at environmental impacts, health impacts. Obama's administration proposed significant budget for that. That was cut. State of Pennsylvania proposed a significant budget to look at environmental health impacts. That was cut. And to me, that's the scary part.
Would any of our other panelists like to comment on what should be done in the face of the continuing scientific uncertainty? No?
I mean, look, the idea that you might want to wait and what's going on before you left too far seems to me an absolute commonplace, especially since we've made it clear, the carbon and methane data makes it clear that there's no great reason to be doing this. But I think the contest here, the reason that it's very hard is because the fossil fuel industry has poured huge resources into making sure that there aren't bans and things. Albany, they spent huge sums of money, and it was only the people of New York rising up to try and stop it that have slowed the onrush of it so far. It's one of these classic fights between big money and people, and it's not okay to just say, well, it's inevitable, it's going to happen. That's not an argument. That's just concession to power, which we've had too much of in this country on too many issues for too long. We need movements, and it is possible to challenge the power of the fossil fuel industry. We may not win this Keystone fight in the long run, but for a year anyway, we've managed to, so far, stop the pipeline to the tar sands of Canada. If you come tonight to the political union, we're going to be talking about the launch of this big nationwide campaign for fossil fuel divestment from places like Yale, all over the country. We've got to stand up to these guys, and fracking is one good place to do it because people all over the place on the ground can see what it feels like, and they don't like it.
Can I respond quickly to that?
Sure.
I think it's a simplification to call this big industry versus the populace. A recent poll was just released by Quinnipiac that said the plurality of upstate New Yorkers, where shale gas development is going to occur, favor shale gas development.
Can I interrupt for just a quick second? My next question was going to be to Sheila, to talk a little bit about, while the many national studies say that the U.S. economy as a whole will benefit from access to shale gas, there's lots of debate about whether that's true at the local level. So building on Jim's question about sort of the attitudes of upstate New Yorkers, what are you seeing in your economic work about the costs and benefits to local communities where shale gas development is happening?
So this is, again, a key question. So the work that Brad's referring to, there's a project going on at Resources for the Future where I currently work. It's funded by the Sloan Foundation, has many different parts, but it's very much focused on the environmental risk side of shale gas. So we're thinking about that in the local and the national context. But as economists, we also think very much about the benefit side. That's not the subject of this particular project or papers I've been presenting lately. But I think, first, what I would always used to tell my students is that I don't like to sort of say, well, here are the economic impacts and here are the environmental impacts. Like, the environmental impacts are economic impacts. They have benefits, they have costs, many of them can be monetized, and weighed against each other in a trade-off sense, just like Jim was talking about in the very beginning. And when, we can't really do that on the environmental cost side yet. We just can't. There just isn't enough evidence, and there may not be for quite a long time, because when we're doing data analysis, when we're looking backward, we're learning from what's happened before, right? As Jim mentioned, we're sort of playing catch-up in a sense, and maybe there's some sense in which this is going to unfold across the country, and one state will learn from another, so there's a little bit of that as well. And so that's sort of a positive thing. But in general, we just don't know. We can't really necessarily quantify or monetize some of those environmental impacts yet. But if we could, it might actually turn out, there are very, very large benefits at the national scale. Okay, just those low prices. Okay, prices for natural gas around a fifth to an eighth of what people were thinking they would be at this point, and certainly looking forward. The country anticipated being a significant importer of natural gas from countries like Russia, Venezuela, Iran, right? So there are certainly these very big benefits that come from the lower prices, the increased consumption that increases consumer surplus, it increases profits for producers, and that, right, the sort of rising tide, right, has the potential at least to lift all boats. So then the main question is, what does the cost side look like? And we're not talking about production costs. We have to assume that those are certainly low enough to be generating the kind of supply that we're seeing today. But the external costs, the ones that are the harder ones to quantify. So even at the national level, it's hard to say. It's just that you can't just sort of turn a blind eye to those very big benefits, particularly during time of recession. So then the second important question becomes, what about these distributional questions, right? What about the sort of tending to be rural areas in states all over the country where a lot of the extraction is taking place, although there are exceptions to that. Fort Worth, Texas, right? There's some urban areas where there's a significant amount of resource extraction as well. How does that compare to how people are feeling in the cities? I mean, in fact, a lot of the opposition in New York has to do with worry over impacts of surface water supplies, and much of what's driving that is the fact that New York City is the sort of end of that pipeline, right? You have 8 million people that are concerned about impacts in the Delaware River Basin. So those distributional impacts are really, I think, driving a lot of this discussion. And I have also read the poll that Jim was talking about, that a narrow plurality of New Yorkers support shale gas development. I think there are some studies that have been done about local economic impacts. Okay, so you can imagine you're in this community, you're in one of 2 groups of people. You are either a leaseholder or you're not, or you sort of sold your land or the rights to the minerals underneath your land to an operator or not. If you have, you are in many cases receiving some significant financial compensation for that. If you haven't, then you're not. And so that might be one way to think about the sort of winners and losers at the local level. But there's also regional economic development impacts, like you've got all of this sort of classic boomtown impact. If anyone has spent time up there, you go to a city like Williamsport, Pennsylvania, home of the Little League World Series. Not that it wasn't always a great town in many ways, but now it's really, it's kind of amazing. You're going to pay $400 a night to stay at the Marriott Courtyard because there's just no space. There are people everywhere. The amount of economic activity is huge, and there are unquestionably benefits to that as well. So a lot of studies that have been done at that regional level have focused on this, what really is a short to medium run impact of those local benefits, and tried to quantify those. And the hard thing from an economic perspective is that it's kind of tough to quantify those, particularly the employment impacts. So those are the big numbers that get thrown around. The studies that are done, by the state of New York, state of Pennsylvania, interest groups on both sides, often focus on this jobs question, and we can see why they've done that. They've done that because we have high rate of unemployment. It's a big focus on the national scene, and so it's thought to be an important sort of chip in the discussion. But the truth is that economics, there are actually not that many academic economists that work on this question of job creation. And that's because labor is mobile. A job created in one place is often moving somebody in that same place out of another sector, or moving labor from one place to another. And there are benefits if you're talking about town A and town B. Town A can attract a lot more development because it's got some fracking going on, but that might be at some potential cost to town B because it's drawn those folks away from there. So quantifying those labor impacts actually is really tricky. It has to be done very well. It's not something anybody would even be talking about, certainly on the national scale if we were at full employment, or employment, let's say, less than 5% in this country. It is something we're talking about because we're in that situation, and it's an important factor, but I haven't seen one study done at the national level or at the regional level that I would say is a really good study that's as careful as it should be in trying to quantify those impacts on employment. So I would just approach those studies with skepticism, and that's not to say that there aren't important local regional economic impacts, but I would be careful on the employment question, which is often the big number that gets thrown around. And then finally, I would say that, these regions have been through this before, some of them. Okay, Pennsylvania is a great case because we've had oil in Pennsylvania, we've had coal mining in Pennsylvania, and still do in some ways also in some of the regions, particularly in the Southwest, where we also now have shale gas. And so there is actually a boom-bust cycle to this sort of dependence on resource extraction to drive the local economy. And there are ways of managing that. There are ways of trying to sort of smooth that out over time. There are ways of trying to manage the downside. I'm not sure that I would say any of that's in place. In fact, in Pennsylvania, until recently, it was one of only 4 states out of 32 with some shale gas that had no severance tax. Okay, now there's not a severance tax, it's an impact fee, and they have a formula by which they're redistributing that to local municipalities and to counties and so on. But what you need is sort of a system in place that's going to sort of smooth out that boom-bust cycle over time and leave something. Right, once the decline curves on those wells are kind of near the bottom and we don't see the extraction happening, generating those benefits locally, what happens then? So I think that's also an important question. And again, none of these important questions about regional impacts should detract from the fact that there are very significant national benefits to this whole process. It's just that the distributional questions then become very important.
just to add to our database, I did a little work here, and poll 7 weeks ago of New York State voters asked just the question that Jim was asked a minute ago: should we wait for studies to be completed before opening the state to fracking? 72% of New Yorkers, including 66% across the shale belt, think it would be a good idea to wait until we've done the work before we do this. So just to add to the database a little bit.
Jim or John, want to add anything to this? So John, let me go back to the standards point that you mentioned in your introductory remarks. You talked about folks working on voluntary standards that the industry might sign. Maybe a two-part question. One, many people would say, why voluntary? Why not regulatory standards? And so how do you see those two comparing? And then related to that, whether it's voluntary or regulatory, what are the key features of standards for this industry? What should they look like, and where should they be adopted?
Let me lead into that by just making a comment more generally about hydrocarbons. I never try to convince somebody who's anti-hydrocarbon that they should be pro-hydrocarbon, because that's like converting a Muslim to Christianity or Judaism, and it's unlikely to occur, and I say that quite seriously. But in the backdrop of the standards, let's remember that every day 250 million cars are on the highways of America. Every home in America needs electricity. So there's two kinds of energy we use in this country. One is electrons, and the other is transportation fuels. When it comes to standards, there are regulatory agencies that go through the governance process of establishing rules, regulations, where companies have to apply for licenses, and in order to get the licenses, they have to guarantee, they have to demonstrate that they can meet the standards and the rules. The standards and the rules are established in a democratic fashion through public hearings, through best-known science, through best-known regulatory processes, and there is follow-up to make sure that those standards are being followed. But as we all know, we're a nation that is ruled by law. Why do we have so many prisoners in prisons? They break the law. They don't follow the rules. Unfortunately, there are some actors in the industry that break the rules. They don't follow the rules. They'd rather cut corners, save a buck, or save a lot more than a buck. And they help destroy the image of an industry that is predicated on the license to operate, which is a public gift. And to suggest that the oil companies are out to control society is simply a made-up statement, because it's society which demands energy. And the oil companies are the facilitators of getting the energy to those who demand it. And it has been always thus, in my opinion. But let's, as a society, hold people to standards. The reason there are voluntary standards is there are companies who feel that the regulations don't go far enough. But when the democratic process creates those regulations, the argument around cost, the argument around ability to operate, not license to operate, but ability to operate. And so there is a back and forth, a give and a take. Ultimately, it's the government official that sets the regulations. The source of much of that information as to setting the regulations comes from the industry. Government itself does not grow the talent base that knows enough about the science or the industrial processes to know how to set the regulations and the standards. They're human beings who learn and have a lot of knowledge, but not enough knowledge. There are companies like my former company, Exxon, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, and others who I'm happy to name, because I'm proud of their willingness and their ability to sign up for tougher standards. Because from a competitive standpoint, they would rather weed out those who aren't willing to meet the standards, deny them the license to operate, but in a free society, those companies still have a voice, and they can connect with elected officials just like anybody else. They can connect with regulators just like anybody else. And in the give and the take of the process, the regulators don't always set the golden standard. Secretary Salazar, since he's been in office, in the Department of Interior, has talked about establishing the golden standard for offshore drilling. The industry has testified in favor of those standards and is complying with those standards in the deepwater Gulf of Mexico since the horrible incident. And so I'm a big believer that standards, mandatory, are oftentimes not the highest, just like student testing. There could be a lot higher standard in student testing, but many students wouldn't make the grade. So at some point you make a judgment as to what the standard should be. That's the regulatory effect. But those companies who have the capability, the technology, and the willingness to go further do indeed go further. So their cement job is a little tighter. The threading that they demand on the tubulars that go underground is more rigid, more in their control. The downwell fracking process, the materials, the chemicals used in the fracking itself. Many of the companies are moving to, through biochemical research, are moving to bio lubricants made from biomass, which really do not have the harmful effects of some of the other chemical potions that have been put down because they're not natural, they're refined. And so there are these kinds of things that happen, and it really is in the name of sustained operations to maintain that license to operate.
The notion that we've set standards on energy use in this country through an open democratic process where everyone had the same stake is incorrect. The biggest contributors year after year to our political process, including if you read the New York Times last Friday to this year's political process, are the fossil fuel industry by a large margin. In the case of fracking, far from setting things by some kind of open process where we looked at the best standards of things, it's every journalist who's ever written about it has told the story of how Dick Cheney, pretty much under cover of darkness, rammed through what's known as the Halliburton Rule that exempts the fracking industry from the Safe Drinking Water Act. For the most part, we have no idea what chemicals people are putting down wells because they don't have to tell us. That's what, in the real world, how this happens. The question, the sort of idea that society demands energy and the energy industry is just there to convey it, misses that essential reality. Society demands energy, but society would be just as happy, perhaps happier, if it came from things like the wind and the sun. The people who wouldn't be happier are the Exxons and the Shells and the Chevrons, because they're making more money than any companies in the history of money, selling hydrocarbons right at the moment. And the idea that one would be anti-hydrocarbon or pro-hydrocarbon, and that it's sort of like being Christian or Muslim, is strikes me as a strange analogy. Hydrocarbons have been very useful in the past, and now, from everything that our scientists tell us, including many of the great physicists and chemists here at Yale, we know that they are posing a risk to the planet greater than any risk the planet has ever undergone before. It's not a negotiation between Christians and Muslims or Democrats and Republicans or some other kind of flavors of things. It's a negotiation at this point between human beings on the one hand and physics on the other, okay? And physics is not pro-hydrocarbon entry. It's just going to do what it's going to do with the amount of carbon that we put up in the atmosphere. And, given the pictures that come back from the Arctic this year, given the scenes across the Midwest of what the drought looked like, given what happens if you stick a pH strip in the ocean these days, it's pretty clear what side physics at this point is on, I think.
Bill, can I follow up on that?
Yes.
With a question? Pretty obviously, shale gas, hydrofracking is not your bridge to a clean energy future. Can you talk a little bit about what you see as the transformative leap that needs to be taken? And how do we best get there in the current political and economic climate? And given the young environmental leaders in the room, what's most important for them to do to help make that happen?
In technical terms, the first most important transformative technology is incredible push toward conservation and efficiency. which we're capable of making very, very large gains with. It gets harder the more cheap energy we have around. Second thing is that renewables are now, 20 years ago we talked about renewables with our fingers crossed, and because they weren't quite ready for prime time, but that's not the case anymore. There were days last month when Germany, the one large country that's taken seriously this problem, generated more than half the power that it used from solar panels within its borders. That to me says that the problem we face is not technological, it's a question of political will. And the engineers are getting, are getting better and better at that.
Lean forward.
I'm sorry.
We're getting comments from the other rooms.
The engineers are getting better and better at dealing with the problems that used to plague us, things like intermittency, that made it more difficult. There was a study yesterday that came out demonstrating that you could, with 144,000 wind turbines up and down the East Coast, offshore, generate all the electricity that the East Coast used. You wouldn't have to do it all by wind, but it made it clear that you could. It does not come for free. It comes at a cost. But the cost is definitely less than the cost of dealing with a planet heating out of control, and that's important to remember is the option always on the other side here. So, I mean, as to how we're going to get here in our current political climate, there's only, we may not. The power of the fossil fuel industry is enormous. They have all the money. So if we're going to do anything about it, we need to find other currencies in which to work. I would submit those are most likely to be the currencies of movement. Passion, spirit, creativity. Sometimes, like Gus Speth, you might need to spend your body, in the course of this. But that's what movements are like, and one really hopes that one will arise here in New Haven in the course of the next months, and that you guys will demonstrate what that other approach to political power looks like. You're not going to have the money to match the Exxons and the Shells, but you may have other things that you can bring to the table.
Speaking for my former company, which I must do under these circumstances, Shell makes no political contributions at all, has not, and has it as a matter of global policy.
Is Shell a member of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce?
I don't know. It was when I was there.
Yes, it is. And the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has been the biggest front group for the fossil fuel industry. It was the biggest donor in the last election cycle, and it filed a brief with the EPA 2 years ago saying that we didn't need to worry about climate change because if by some mystery all the scientists turned out to be right and the planet heated up, it would be okay. Human beings would adapt their behavior and physiology in order to deal with a warmer planet. It's akin to what the CEO of Exxon said this summer before the Council on Foreign Relations. He said, true, global warming's real, but it's an engineering problem with engineering solutions. Someone asked him what those might be. He said, well, if we need to move our crop production areas, by which I believe he meant farms, if we need to move our crop production areas, we will. This is the example of the kind of fantasy that reigns within the fossil fuels. Despite the fact that they're quickly melting the taiga for us, you can't just, when it gets too hot to grow corn in Iowa, the way it did this summer, move the whole operation up to the, up onto the tundra. There's not soil there to do it. It's time to start taking real.
Let me correct a myth.
Yes.
Let me correct a myth that the oil industry is homogeneous and is of unanimous voice. I found Rex Tillerson's speech at the Council on Foreign Relations to be a backward-looking, self-serving Exxon shareholder speech that did not speak for the industry. It spoke for ExxonMobil. I'm on the public record many, many times, over and over, even as president of Shell, that there should be no private money in campaign financing. Campaign financing should be public money only, because it is true. The abusive power of money in campaign financing creates unfortunate outcomes, and I consider it destructive to the democratic principles on which the country was founded. I may be a rarity in the industry that says that.
And in that case,
but in the course of these discussions, I think it's important to note that there are differences of opinion within the energy industry, and no one speaks for the energy industry. Each company speaks for itself.
in that case, it would be a very good idea to get Shell and others out of the Chamber of Commerce and out of the American Petroleum Institute, which have been the sort of pass-throughs by which people have supported, both lobbied heavily and supported candidates for office.
Well, here, if you step out, then you can't influence the outcome. You have to be a part of it to influence the outcome. In the case of the API, for example, most of what the American Petroleum Institute does is set industry-wide standards which apply to the whole world, ultimately. And to have your voice at the table to set those standards is a very important part of membership. The same with the Chamber of Commerce. When I sit with Tom Donahue, or sat with Tom Donahue as president of Shell, to tell him my view on cap and trade, having been one of the founders of the United States Climate Action Partnership, having worked for years to create a cap and trade policy for this country, only to have the framework created by the US CAP, which consisted of a large number of companies, NGOs, and worked in voluntary fashion to create a framework for Congress in the 110th Congress, having said to Ed Markey, having said to Mr. Waxman, don't rush this. If you rush this, you'll kill it. The country's not ready. This needs time. This needs seasoning. This needs to be baked in the oven. And how many, but they rushed. They got the House to pass it. I said to Markey shortly after the House passed it, dead on arrival in the Senate, which it was. Now we have a presidential campaign several years later. How much are we hearing about cap and trade? Absolutely nothing. By rushing things in this democracy, we go backwards. We have to change incrementally. We have to change carefully. We have to change in a way that society can adapt and adjust to it, or we go backwards.
So I want to stay on this theme, but I want to give each of John and Bill a chance to talk about a question of if you could, so we've seen this discourse happening in front of us. You know, is it about anti-hydrocarbons or for hydrocarbons, or is it about the fossil fuel industry being in charge or not being in charge? If each of you could change the nature of the dialogue, if you will, between the energy community and the environmental community, or however you want to frame it, you know, how would you change it? I know, John, you've spent a lot of time going around the country talking to people about it. Bill, you've had a recent article in the Rolling Stone saying basically, you know, the fossil fuel industry pretty much should be written off as a political force. To talk a little bit about what you would, if you made a steps forward, what would be the most important steps, do you think, moving forward on this?
I start with the framework to try to help people understand the incredible size and materiality of the energy system. And given its history and given where we are, I try to start with a framework of, let's talk in a dialogue that talks about short-term, medium-term, and long-term. Where short-term is 0 to 10 years. Because in energy space, nothing really happens in less than 10 years. It takes time. Medium-term, 10 to 25. Long-term, 25 to 50. Once you get people talking in terms of the three sections of what do you do now, what do you do later, what do you do over time, I think we can create a carbon-free energy system. But we can't get there by rushing it in the course of a short period of time. It won't happen. We don't have the technology. You know, we are not going to build, you know, the million or more wind turbines it would take in this country to make a material impact on the energy system. The public won't allow it. People don't like I love wind turbines. I think they're an art form when you see them all together turning in synchronicity or in synchrony. But a lot of people hate them, especially people that have them on their ranches. They don't like what happens. They don't like to see it built. The land gets torn up. I've been there. I had a wind business when I was at Shell. I had the hateful comments from the ranchers, get off my property. And so we did. We just went to the next property. But the key point here is break it into time spans that people can get their heads around in a way in which real work can be done. The second thing I would say is this is not the oil companies versus society. This is public policy fed by special interest money versus the needs of society. in which society doesn't really know enough yet to have a point of view that is informed. You're fortunate because you have lots of information. The people I generally talk to are from church sanctuary podiums or from high school stages or other grassroots engagements where people don't know. And when you don't know what you don't know where you're going. And so grassroots education becomes fundamental. Not ideological education, but real education about what it takes to know what you need to know if you're going to be a voter and a citizen. And so I think that we need the public policy leadership of a short, medium, long-term plan, which we have been unable to achieve in the modern age.
Bill, in your recent Rolling Stone article, you called fossil fuel industry public enemy number one. How would you see this?
In my short-term scenario, I think maybe the very first thing I'd do would be to have, if I was able to influence things powerfully, would be to have the fossil fuel industry stop exploring for new hydrocarbons. They already have, at that point of that Rolling Stone piece with these set of UK financial analysts who determined that the fossil fuel industry already had 5 times as much hydrocarbons in their reserves as it would take to move us past the 2-degree mark that the world's governments have agreed on as the sort of red line. In fact, it's much too high a red line. 1 degree melts the Arctic, so 2 degrees. But I would stop exploring for new hydrocarbons. For instance, were I Shell, I would not be, as they have in the last 6 weeks, been leading the rush into the Arctic to begin drilling. Drilling made possible only because they've melted the Arctic over the last 40 years. But it's Shell that's up there finding, Exxon spends $100 million a day looking for new hydrocarbon. Fracking is a perfect example of this kind of work. The problem with the kind of short, medium, long-term, all this sort of thing is we're running out of time. It's tiresome for me to say, though I take at least the tiniest bit of satisfaction in saying it, that having written the first book about all this 25 years ago, if you'd listened to me then, you know, we would have been able to do some of these things at a slightly different time scale. Here's the numbers. If we're going to stay below that 2 degrees, okay, at the moment that we have an allotment of about 565 gigatons worth of carbon left to burn. We're currently burning about 31 gigatons worth a year, and it's increasing about 3% a year. Do the math on your iPhone. We're 16 years away from going past the line that even the most conservative governments on earth, the United Arab Emirates, China, even the US, have signed onto as the kind of bottom red line. This is not about our convenience, about what would be nice and easy for society, about a gentle and soft landing for the fossil fuel industry and its shareholders. It's about trying to keep from breaking the planet, which is what we're currently doing.
So, Sheila, you've been doing some research on aspects of this debate that we've been having, surveys of experts and their perceptions of, or their findings on the risks of shale gas, and also of the general public and their perceptions of the risks. Can you tell us about how those perceptions and impressions compare? And if they are pretty disconnected, what kinds of changes or what kinds of programs going forward do you think would make the most sense?
Yeah, so what Brad is referring to there, as part of this major project at RFF, there are 2 different surveys, one of which is done and being analyzed, and there's a draft report in place, and that is an attempt to kind of look forward. So as I said, when we're working with observational data, trying to understand, you know, what some of the environmental risks are from this activity, we have to look backward. We have to say, okay, well, let's see, you know, how shale gas development, you know, looked in Pennsylvania over the last few years, and what have been the impacts on water quality. But things change quickly, and so while that's a really important exercise and one can learn from that exercise, what we wanted to do when we started the project was to say, well, the literature is pretty thin. I mean, there's a huge literature in the sort of petroleum engineering sense of, you know, how to get gas out of these wells cost effectively, you know, what a productive well looks like, what the well design looks like, but a really, really thin literature on what the potential risks might be. And so we thought, well, one thing that one could do, in addition to just waiting, right, for the sort of incremental contributions of science in the way that that works, would be to look at those contributions, but also to do a survey of folks that are working kind of on the front lines in this field, in academics, in industry, in government, and in NGOs, and get a sense for what, if there's some degree of consensus that we can find over what some of the highest priority impacts are. Or potential impacts, I should say, are. And so we sort of set up a system whereby we developed a set of what we were calling priority impact pathways, going all the way from a sort of piece of the shale gas development process to some, endpoint. So, for example, you have fracturing and completion of a well, and one of the activities associated with that is truck traffic, and truck traffic generates local air pollutants, and that has impacts on human health and so on. So there's all these different pathways, and it turned out we came up with about 264 of those, and that formed the basis of this expert survey. And what we had people do is had them go through and choose, which ones of these, this whole set, given your expertise, given your training, got lots of information about that for each respondent, are what you would call sort of high priority. And then we're able to look across those groups and see, kind of how they compare and try and find some, kind of red lines underneath particular potential impacts, so that would point the way forward for either more research or some voluntary action on the part of industry, or some regulatory action, or some combination of all three of those. And the interesting thing, so I think it's very easy to feel when you're hearing debates on a panel like this that things are just so polarized on a question like the climate question or something else that it's really hard to see that there's a middle ground, or even if there was, whether you'd be interested in it at all. I think I'm more of an incrementalist than Bill, and so I'm happy to sort of be searching for that middle ground, and I'm hopeful that the middle ground will be a place where we find some net benefits, even including environmental impacts. And the nice thing is that in this survey, if you look at these results, if we take the top 20 of all those pathways that each respondent identified, and we compare them across groups, 12 of those pathways are in common across all the 4 groups. Okay, that includes NGOs and industry, which we sort of tend to think about as representing the sort of polar opposite views on these questions. And it's really interesting stuff. So you take those 12 that are held in common, there's some consensus there. 7 of those are impacts to surface water, 2 are to groundwater, 2 are to air quality, but they're both about methane, not about local air pollutants. And then the final one is about habitat fragmentation from infrastructure, well pads, roads, pipelines, and so on. And so for us, right, so my perspective is let's sort of find that, are there some areas of consensus where we can get a sense, and they may be wrong, right? This is, again, the nature of this kind of exercise, is that in 10 years we could say, boy, we really thought that this surface water thing was going to be a problem. But it turns out, it's something we didn't know about. So there's no way to know, right, for sure whether these are the right things, but it can help sort of point us in the right direction. So I think one positive thing from that aspect of our work has been thinking, well, there's actually more consensus than you might think. Where it breaks down is when you ask people, well, what should we do about this? And so then there we see, if we ask people, should it be, sort of industry that takes primary responsibility for addressing this particular pathway, or should it be primarily government regulation or some combination of the two? There's actually a surprising number of people in all 4 of the groups that say some combination. But, as you might expect, that, there's a pretty strong feeling in industry that industry should take the lead. On average, there's a pretty strong feeling among NGOs that government should take the lead, and then the other groups fall in between. And I take to heart John's earlier comment about the heterogeneity within industry. Just as one example of that, I've given briefs on this work to EPA, and I've given briefs on this work to API, and I did the one to API over the web and on the phone. And by accident, a group of industry folks in a boardroom, and I won't say which operator or which major firm, left their kind of connection on, so I was hearing the discussion, and I had to tell them not, to switch it off because everybody was hearing the discussion. But as I went through this divide about who should take the lead, obviously there was a reasonably significant amount of industry response that said either government should take the lead or that there should be shared responsibility. And you could hear everybody at this table saying, "Who would have said that?" Right? Like, why would you say anything but industry should take the lead, right? But there are, of course, people on the phone who were respondents to the survey that said, in fact, that government should take the lead. So there is a lot of heterogeneity, and again, I find that to be sort of a source of hope. And then this other survey that we're doing, it's basically a survey of individuals, so just households in Pennsylvania and in Texas, where we're asking people to make, as economists tend to do in their surveys, explicit trade-offs between what they might be willing to pay in increased energy bills, for example, for reductions in specific types of risks associated with shale gas development. Okay, so we give them a careful description of what some of those risks might be. We actually can change the language, and we're doing some of that. We sort of express it in the API-style language and NGO-style language, and what we are hoping is a neutral style, or RFF-style language. And we can see whether that shifts people's perceptions of risk, whether it shifts their willingness to pay. Unfortunately, the results of that are not back in yet. We have some interesting stuff that's happening in focus groups, but I can't say ex ante yet what the comparison will be, but we certainly are interested in doing that to see how well individual or sort of household perceptions of risk match up with those of experts.
Any comments from any other members of the panel on this sort of perception issue? Jim, let me go back to something you said earlier about there's not enough research, there's not enough funding for research in this area. A common complaint amongst faculty. So let's assume that you actually had lots of money and you look across the potential impacts from water supplies, air quality, rural lands impacts, community impacts, and whatnot. Which of those impacts would you focus on sort of as highest priority, and what would you do, and what would you be looking for to help you figure out where to go forward from here?
Generally speaking, what's missing are measurements. If you look across air impacts, land impacts, water quality impacts, there's just a dearth of measurements. So, for example, if you would take water, there's an assumption that's made that when wells are hydraulically fracked, they're too deep, there's not enough water injected, the overlying rock is too impermeable for that water to rise up and contaminate drinking water supplies. That's an assumption. A lot of people believe it. I believe it. It's just my opinion. And so what we have is a lot of expert opinions without ever running the experiment. So that might be one place where you would begin to look. Another concern related to water quality is methane contamination. You've all seen about it. You've seen it in gas land, people lighting their taps on fire. That arises from poor casing, poor well construction. And so industry and regulatory agencies have responded, and they've made well construction, they've raised the standards. So the question is, well, are those standards good enough? Well, you would run an experiment and say, well, let's take a look at these new casing methods and see if they really do protect aquifers. On the air quality side, there's concerns about greenhouse gas emissions, volatile organic carbon, and methane release. Is my fellow panelists have suggested before, there's a lot of debate here. And once again, what's missing are measurements. And EPA is getting in on this. They will require methods or measurements of greenhouse gas emissions from these sites soon, and that's a step forward.
I think that what Jim was getting at the end there is exactly right. The thing that if you wanted to know one thing, it would be what methane release rates are into the atmosphere, I think. I mean, no one here has argued with my basic contention that even in carbon terms, you end up with a 3.5 Celsius degree warmer world if you convert it to gas, that you end up at 660 parts per million. So that's bad, even if you go this course. But there's a chance that we're making this much, much worse by adding a lot of methane to the atmosphere. If those 4% leak rates that prevailed in Colorado actually prevail across the industry, then we're just adding greenhouse gases at a terrific rate to the atmosphere doing this. So that would be the thing that if there were some graduate students looking for something to work on, that's the thing I'd like most to know about right away, because it's kind of an emergency question.
It is an emergency question. And it's also a relatively easy one to fix. Methane emissions from gas wells occur during the flowback period, before the well, after it's completed, is hooked up to the natural gas lines. there are such a thing as green completions that collect that gas that's released before that hookup. But there is a question that reduces methane emissions. How much? Another big contributor to air quality impairment is just the sheer number of diesel engines involved in shale gas extraction, to run pumps, to run compressor stations, and there are ways to improve that. Shift, for example, from diesel engines to compressed natural gas. So there are ways around it, or at least ways to mitigate.
John, do you have any areas that you think are particularly worthy of further research?
Well, I think that I would switch gears in terms of that research. I think that we need to make progress in, as I said earlier, tightening the wells and applying new forms of technology to make things ever more precise in the natural gas area. But where we need research and where we need to apply that research is in what I believe will be the alternative energy sources of the future. Today's solar is little better than commercial junk, with all due respect to those who make it. It simply is not sufficiently efficient to ever take and grab at an affordable level the needs of society. We have to put a lot of time and energy into nanotechnology research to create the material that has yet to be created that will create the efficiencies needed. And by efficiencies needed, I'm talking north of 40% efficiencies on a sustained basis, because not only of the cost-benefit reality competing against other sources, but we have one chance in a generation to lead the world. And if we don't agree on a way forward in this society with only 5% of the world's population, the rest of the world is going to just go do whatever they do. There is no leadership out there. Europe, with all due respect, can't afford what they're trying to do, and they're about to go belly up. They're officially, technically bankrupt. They just haven't admitted it yet in terms of their deficit financing. We're headed down that pathway, unfortunately, as well. But we have the best technology in the world, the best innovative minds, the best universities in the world, bar none. No one argues with that I've ever heard that says we can't do what we need to do from a research and development standpoint. So I'm a big believer in solar, but only if we can crack the code with nanotechnology. I'm a big believer in biofuels, but we haven't cracked the code in biochemistry yet to get to process solutions to create the kind of scale we would need to create to really substitute for oil. Natural gas can be a transportation fuel. We know how to do that. We ought to just get on and do it and reduce oil imports and lower the use of oil in total in our society. We also have to have whatever is the ultimate debate between uranium and thorium as a future for nuclear fission. We have huge dependence upon ancient nuclear reactors in this country with no idea what we're going to do next other than extend the life cycle of a nuclear reactor. That's our only solution. That's going to come to a screeching halt when we have a meltdown somewhere because of the age of the reactor. New book out, Superfuel, by James Martin. Ought to read it because it is the opportunity to have a different nuclear future. Because we can't get off coal, we can't get off hydrocarbons if we don't have substitute alternatives. And today's wind and today's solar, today's geothermal, which is almost nothing, today's hydropower, big old silted over dams. We're not going to get there from here based on what we've got. And so it is in the science area that I think we have to make big breakthroughs.
So at the risk of maybe taking us a little over time, we've been taking questions from our satellite locations, and we got one in from Bowers Hall across the way that I think might be a good one to end on, and I'm tempted to go in reverse order. So Bill, John, Sheila, and Jim. What does the shale gas controversy tell us about issues of power and politics in the U.S. versus issues of science? As a School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, in a research university, we face these questions of science and management, science and policy all the time. To the extent that you all can comment on those in this particular context, that would be, I think, quite interesting to our audience. Bill, you willing to take a crack first?
Sure. Everything to do with the fossil fuel industry tells you where power lies. This is the one industry in the entire world that doesn't have to pay to put out its waste. it gets to pour carbon into the atmosphere for free. And they have defended that perk with every political tool at their disposal for a long time, and will continue to. They may accept some small price on carbon someday, but we know now that, to be effective in any meaningful way, it'll have to be a hefty price on carbon, one that keeps 80% of current reserves underground, because any more than that will take us past 2 degrees. So the question before us, and I really liked what Sheila said a minute ago, but she was saying she was more an incrementalist than I was. And that's, I suppose, true at this point, but it has nothing to do with my own particular take on things. I mean, I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher. I'm as mild-mannered as it's possible to be in most ways. It's that physics isn't incrementalist at this point. What does it tell you when the Arctic is melted? We've taken, one of the biggest physical features on our planet and destroyed it in the course of 40 years. And, name any other big physical feature on the planet, you can say about the same thing. That's what political power looks like. And the scientists told us 25 years ago what was going to happen. And they have been proven right in every dimension about climate change. And yet it hasn't deterred the fossil fuel industry from doing a thing. Shell is still up there pushing into the Arctic to drill for yet more oil. That's how it works.
John?
2 things. One, I come back to the comment I made earlier on citizen education. We have got to raise the level of awareness and understanding of the risks and the opportunities relative to everyday citizens, and do it in ways that are meaningful with real data, not with slogans or symbols, but with real information about the real risks and the real opportunities. Secondly, I don't think we're going to get off hydrocarbons anytime in the next 30, 40, 50 years. So the effort that needs to be done from a scientific standpoint is, how do we clean up those hydrocarbons? I think there's huge opportunity to clean hydrocarbons and to operate with hydrocarbons in a way in which there is far less emission. For example, I could imagine an emissionless refinery. Not overnight, but over a 10, 20, 30-year period, every refinery gets rebuilt by virtue of the capital investment made with new process technology, new innovations, new regulations, et cetera. Set the target of emissionless refineries. That would have a huge impact in places like the Gulf Coast, where refineries are intensely emitting into the atmosphere. I know people say, clean coal is an oxymoron. Well, how do we know that? How do we actually know that until we've tried? We haven't really tried. Carbon capture with sequestration, with coal gasification, with 98% of the emissions not emitted, but rather buried. How do we know that that's not the case? When theoretically it is the case, let's see if we can do that. So we have a way with existing or known technology to try to dramatically clean up hydrocarbons. And yes, I think methane leaks from gas wells should be stopped. We should have well inspections. We should have well reporting. And that just simply makes common sense. Because why put methane into the atmosphere that you could otherwise capture and sell commercially? There's a certain commerciality here that doesn't make sense to leak methane when that's your source of shareholder value. And so there are a lot of things that we could do that we aren't doing, and whether it's because the regulations aren't sufficient or because individual companies aren't committed to it, I think that social pressure can change all of that. And that's where informed citizens make a difference.
Sheila?
It's interesting to me, the question is divide, is it powered politics versus science? I mean, there couldn't have been more science in the application of hydraulic fracturing to shale gas. I mean, you have to think about that as, I'm not a cardiologist and I'm not a petroleum engineer, so I can't make the comparison that John made earlier and be, in a careful way, but you have to think about the fact that this resource, this sort of vast new, newly economic domestic resource, it was always there, it just wasn't economic to extract, is largely the product of 2 things. One, high energy prices at the time, right? We were talking about a future of very expensive natural gas in the U.S., and so if the price was going to be that high, I mean, it's just like you might learn in a sort of 101 natural resource economics class. Well, that drives this process of private research and development exploration, trying to apply these new technologies to existing resources. But it was also the product of large public investments. So if you sort of look at the history of the development of the technology itself, no matter which resource it's being applied to, there's a huge federal investment in that as well, through the Department of Energy and other institutions. So this question of, is power and politics or science? I mean, this is all science. The problem is that we don't really, at least in my view, have sufficient science on the social cost side to say whether, right, on the whole, this is the right direction, or if it's not, then how should we tweak it to make it the right direction? So I also appreciate John's point about R&D, right? It's just that this here is an example of that in full swing, right? This is the product of massive R&D investments both in the private sector and in the public sector, and what incentivized that, at least on the private side, was high prices. And those same forces are driving investments in renewables and research in renewables, right? And so, I think a part of the question is, how is that going to sort of play out over time so that if this is in fact a transition fuel, right, so that we're in place at the next transition, right, for renewables to have benefited from the same kinds of investments. So I think the role of R&D is critical. It's just that, sometimes R&D produces something that is, is a little different than what you might be thinking of if you're talking about, a low carbon future. And, here we are. This is, we have shale gas. And I think there are lots of pros. I'll leave it at that.
Jim?
I want to end by talking about science in relationship to the New York State moratorium. Moratorium was placed on shale gas development there because they thought that there was a dearth of science. And so supplemental generic environmental impact statement was written, was commented on, it was revised. Now it looks like there's a good possibility that they will open parts of New York State up, at least 5 counties in the southern tier, to shale gas development. So the notion behind that moratorium was we need to learn more. We don't know enough about the environmental impacts. That's a concern. Okay, so we went through this process over a year long. You look at truly the new science that's available after that year compared to what we knew then, there's not much of a difference. There hasn't been a great deal of new science generated. More people have talked about it, there's been greater debate, but they're debating the same old thing. And so science has a role, but science isn't ruling the day in terms of the shale gas development issue.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today's panel, for this wonderfully rich discussion that didn't come anywhere near close to covering all of the questions that had been sent in online and raised in the other rooms, which is why the organizers of this event are going to be hosting a series of continuing conversations, as well as posting some answers to some of the questions online. If you go to the URL up on the screen, that'll be a good place to track these events. I just got notice of one at 7:30 tonight at the Yale Political Union, where Bill will be talking about why Yale should divest from fossil fuels. In just a minute, we'll be inviting you all to a reception out at the other end of the floor, but before that, I hope you'll join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful discussion today.